Thank you very much, Parker, for that very kind and generous introduction. And I want to also thank Robert Purcell for inviting me tonight. And I want to thank Taza Chocolate a third time. Because you'll get to hear about chocolate, but you'll also get to taste it. And I have to say, a lot of times when I go and give this talk, I have a pretty good turnout, and they get sort of angry if there's not chocolate to taste. So thank you, Taza, for saving me. And I'm really especially glad to be here at Brown to talk about this work that I've been doing for the last few years, because it's really here at Brown where my ideas radically changed. And in a way, I found chocolate. That the people and the materials that I got to work with as a fellow at the John Carter Brown Library really changed my mind in so many ways. It was just this constant process of discovery and being led along this chocolate-lined path. And also, it made me reevaluate my archaeological work that I had done before I got here. And I realized that starting from a place of producers and looking at everyday lives, and then looking at how that interacted with and was part of the consuming world of chocolate, led me to a different place. So I feel very much I have something new to say about chocolate. Lots of stuff has been written about chocolate. We love to hear about chocolate. But it also, there's this reaction that, well, we kind of know chocolate. So let's just eat some. So I'm going to show you a few of these. I'm giving you the highlights, basically, of some of the work that I've done. And especially bringing out some of the materials from the JCB that really helped change my mind. And then with the question and answer session, I'm really happy to go into more detail about any of it. And so what I really come to see is that the late, and this is very late, pre-Columbian political and economic dynamics that have to do with cacao, the tree seed from which we make chocolate, and chocolate itself, had a really profound effect on the way colonists made chocolate part of their everyday lives. And that those particular colonial choices that were part of that moment really resonate in our lives today. And what I see about this, I'm used to using these arrows, is that chocolate is this interesting bundle of contradictions. So how would you describe chocolate? Just throw out a few.
Yummy.
Yummy, delicious, right? What else? What do you immediately associate with chocolate?
Sweet.
Sweet.
Decadent.
Bitter, decadent. Rich? Sinful? Healthy?
Stimulating.
Stimulating, yes, absolutely. Stimulating. And healthy, right? And from yesterday, what do you associate with chocolate also?
Love.
So it's contradictory, but it also unites. It's what I think of also is another way that it unites is this kind of superfood, because it crosses a lot of traditional culinary boundaries. That no matter where you go, there's chocolate, pretty much. And that not just there's chocolate, but there's that region's way of making chocolate that's emblematic of their spot. This is what we do with chocolate. This is the kind of dessert or the cake that we have. And so I think of it, chocolate's really a way to be. And it's not a sweet history. So that's part of what I'm going to show you tonight. Is that it has this part of the contradictions that come from it is from this less savory kind of past. And the other thing about chocolate is that we have this sort of comforting narrative that we tend to tell about it. And this is true in scholarly literature as well as popular literature. And what is the story? That it goes from bitter to sweet, from liquid to solid. And I think of that as sort of a tale of colonialism, that these people, these indigenous people who had this stuff, didn't really realize its true potential. It took Europeans coming in to make it something delicious and to make it substantial. But that's the popular narrative. That's the comforting story. And what I am going to present is not that exactly. And then I also have, I've kind of made my confession about chocolate, that neither in my archaeological research nor in my research at the JCB did I go to those places or do that research looking for chocolate. My confession is that chocolate found me. I could not escape it, no matter what. So what is generally broadly known is, and this is through archaeological studies, linguistic analysis, that cacao is domesticated first in the Americas, and then it spreads pretty rapidly throughout the tropical America. And it's been consumed in Mesoamerica, in Mexico and Central America, for at least 4,000 years. But there's very good evidence of that. And if you're not familiar with exactly what cacao is, it grows on a tree. It's an understory tree, and it has these fleshy pods of fruit that grow off of the branches. And inside, here, you can kind of see it. The seeds themselves are covered with this sweet-tasting, a little bit slimy fruit. And then what we consume, what we process and use to make chocolate out of, are the seeds of this fleshy tropical fruit. So it has this long history of use in Mesoamerica. And what was it used for? Well, it was cosmologically very powerful. It was the right sort of offering for certain days, for rituals for certain days. It was used to seal important social contracts and political contracts. So at a marriage, you would consume a cacao preparation on certain days. And for good merchant exchanges and also for travel. Those are common sorts of uses of cacao. And this is an example of a Maya codex, a painted book that is from just before the Spanish arrived in the Americas. And it's an almanac. And this is an everyday kind of thing. It's like a farmer's almanac today. Farmer's almanacs aren't just for kings to use. It's to figure out the weather patterns and so forth. Well, these almanacs would tell you the right day to make a certain kind of offering, when to plant your corn, when to paint your house, that sort of thing. So it shows cacao being the right sort of offering in certain contexts. So it also underscores this idea about cacao as being a way to share morality, shared values. We know also that from archaeological evidence of different kinds that cacao flavored different sorts of foods and drinks. This spouted pot had cacao residues in it, in it. And that particular shape is also very distinctive, distinctively associated with cacao preparations. So not just the tree and the plant itself, but the way that people prepared it was very distinctive. And there was a set of tools that very ancient evidence that carry all the way through the colonial period of this steep spouted pot for preparing and serving. Another object is what's called a molinillo, and you'll see another example. Taza chocolate has a larger, more elaborate sort of, it's a mill, and that's to froth the liquid. So many cacao preparations were frothed drinks. And another way to increase that froth was to pour it from a great height. And again, the steep spout would help with that. Pour it into a steep-sided cup, which helped hold the frothiness. So in many ways, cacao preparations sort of set themselves apart from other kinds of beverages. Now, the other way, and this is something that I've really been working on lately, is not only in general, all of these tools are very consistently associated with cacao, but that each region had their own particular cacao preparations. And here I'm going to give you several examples because I really kind of want to belabor this point because it's very important for my overall argument about chocolate itself. And these examples are painted, bespoke painted vessels that were prepared for particular Maya lords. And they date from about AD 425 to about AD 750. And they have these scenes that often are scenes of different sorts of activities. Sometimes they're feasting activities, different sorts of social interactions, different people depicted on them, and different sorts of foods and beverages and that sort of thing. And then these are readable texts. And these are very specific. And they relate who owned that vessel. So these are things that are not 100 of them were made, or even 20 of them were made. One was made, and it was made for one person. That person's name is on that vessel. And that actually is kind of a standard part of the inscription that tends to go across. So you'll have, this is so-and-so's pot. Archaeologists tend to call these cacao pots because that's often what they were for, to contain cacao preparations. But then the rest of the inscription actually varies quite a bit. And I like to think of them as a kind of recipe, or really, if you're like a cook, an aide-memoire, where you just note the key thing that you have to do that's special to make that dish or that concoction come together the right way. So it's not like a regular cookbook that you see today with each step laid out, but an aide-memoire just cook the chicken, add the wine, and then you put the seasoning in at this point, and you know it's very much more sketchy. So it just hits the high notes in some ways. So, not coffee mug for world's greatest dad, but this is my pot. This is this one thing that goes in there, and then we have dates. A lot of these have dates, so we have a pretty good sense of the taste, the preferences of one person at one time in one place, in many cases. And so in this example, I'm really trying to connect taste to place here, and this is the inscription here talks about Hokab, and that's a name of a Maya city. So it's this one place that it's connected to. What are some other specifics that we get? One of them is this reference to what you can translate as fresh cacao, tsil, in this example, tsil cacao. And in most of these, when I could do it, this glyph here is you'll see it over and over again in the images the next few images I'm going to show you. That's ka, or it can be kakawa. So that's cacao, that's referring to cacao. And then the variation is this is tsili here. In all of these examples that I'm giving, I'm very much following the work of Steve Houston, who's here in the Anthropology department, and the interpretations he's done, as well as David Stewart and Alexander Tocqueville, who's at Harvard now. What does fresh mean in this case? Well, Tocqueville suggests it's not just fresh, but it's the sense of pure and unadulterated, like the pure stuff. So when you go and taste the chocolates outside, the Tasse chocolates, you'll see a progression of higher concentrations of cacao. And at one end is, I can't remember what you call it, but anyway, it's the pure stuff. So think of that, and it has a very intense flavor, and it's also gives you the full effect of the cacao from that one region. So in this case, they're conjuring up this idea of a very, very specific taste related to cacao from a particular region. And different regions had different tastes to them, for sure. Another way to say fresh, so this is just to impress upon this point, is this ach cacao, which could be another variation of this idea of freshness or purity. Another example is ripe cacao, on cacao. And though you might think that that might be a very common sort of phrase to occur over and over again on these sorts of vessels, it's actually, this is the only occurrence. So it's not a catch-all phrase, and it's very specific to this place and this time. Another part of the inscription on this particular vase is this, the ta yutal on cacao. So there's this yutal element. Well, the all ending refers to fruit in general in Maya languages, and specifically Utal and Chorti, one of the Maya languages, very related to the language that the inscriptions are written in, is a word for fruit. So here we have fruity ripe cacao. Well, what could that be? Fruity ripe cacao. There's this drink that is consumed today in Guatemala by Maya people that's called refresco de pocha. And what it is the fruit itself, that tropical fruit, and they consume it either fermented, it ferments very quickly, so it could be a fermented drink or the fresh fruit processed. So, and again, Tocqueville suggested this reading, which I think is very compelling. If that's what's in here, is that what you think of as chocolate? Not at all. It would have the taste of a tropical fruit. Now, other kinds, there are glyphs that refer to sweet cacao. And part of the narrative, remember, is this bitter to sweet. Well, it's clear, not only are these ancient Maya referring to sweet, they're referring to lots of different kinds of sweet. And here, it's an emphasis of just sweet in general. And again, when you sample the Tasse chocolates, there's a sweeter end of the spectrum versus a less sweet end of the spectrum of taste. So, and it's not fruity, right? So it's a different kinds of sweet. Now, another kind of sweet, honey, chabil cacao. And so, again, not free, not just sweet, honey cacao. And another example, and again, this is a fairly recent work of reading. Here's the cacao glyph again, and reading what this logogram means. And if you look at this shape, it's very distinctive, kind of roundish looking. Here's another example, and I've shown the different parts of the inscription, the cacao glyph, and then this round cherry-looking thing, berry. So, and there are some other elements of the inscription that really permit a reading that's this word suits, And so what is suits, and again in Chorti, in a contemporary Maya language, it can refer to a cherry-like fruit. And Tocqueville suggested that it might be this North American wild cherry. And I contacted, there's a very systematic, thorough survey of Maya animals and plants that Nicholas Helmuth has done. And I said, well, do you see many of these capulin cherry trees in your survey? And he's like, I haven't seen them. Doesn't mean they're not there somewhere, but he suggested several other berry trees that could be a good, quite possible. But again, it's this round fruit that it's evoking. Now, again, sort of other sorts of cacao preparations. This reading is sal cacao. And this would be, sal is a preparation of mostly cacao mixed with a little bit of corn gruel. So something thick. And I have tried, and it doesn't actually work super well in this area. I was trying to think of something that's kind of like this, a thick corn gruel. Immediately, as a southerner, I think of grits. But, it's not so common around here. But anyway, that's sort of the idea, this really thick sort of preparation. And another, and again, connecting taste and place, this particular example found only in areas east of the Maya city of Tikal. So very, very restricted in where you see these inscriptions occurring. Whereas the cherry cacao that I just showed you, you only see it in Tikal. You don't see it in other places. Now this kind of corn gruel mix also includes another form of the inscription that's Cacao ul, and that is more corn gruel, less cacao. It's like majority corn. So in these inscriptions, they're being very careful to sort of refer to the preparation, all these varieties of preparations. Then the other thing is we tend to think, in these very generic terms of it's all chocolate, it's all hot, right? It's all beverages. Well, the saka is definitely a cold preparation. It's something that's served cold with these cooked corn kernels and some cacao. And it's very important in different sorts of social and religious events. It's something that you'd serve as a proper proper thing to consume at ceremonies. Now, I could go on, but I think you've had enough examples at this point. There are lots of inscriptions, lots of different preparations. This really, and they refer to different kinds of processing, stages of ripeness, and it's really clear that it's my pot, this cacao, and Stephen Houston really has argued that you could do a mapping of these recipes and come up with a political geography based just on these cacao preparations. Now, it's not just the Maya who are doing these sorts of things. It's really throughout Mesoamerica that you see all of these, this variation. And this example is from Bernardino de Sahagun's General History of New Spain. And you have one column that's in Spanish, one that's in the indigenous language of Nahuatl. And I have to tell you, and you can see here that these are women in a marketplace. This vessel is for serving atole, the corn gruel that I was talking about. And this vessel is for serving cacao. So again, it's particular vessels, ways of preparing. And the description here of the cacao beverage seller is, they use this word atla quetzali. Well, ach is referring to sort of a liquid state, so water or cacao. And then quetzali, have you heard of a quetzal bird? It's that same root beautiful, the idea is beautiful, shimmering, wonderful, luxurious, like all these good things bundled into that one term. So, a seller of fine cacao is Atlaquetzali. And I'll read you just this one passage that describes her. The seller of fine cacao is one who grinds, who provides people with drink, with repasts. She grinds cacao, she crushes, breaks, pulverizes the beans. She chooses, selects, separates them. She drenches, soaks, steeps them. She adds water sparingly, conservatively, aerates it, filters it, strains it, pours it back and forth, aerates it. She makes it form a head, makes it foam. She removes the head, makes it thicken, makes it dry, pours water in, stirs water into it. I have to tell you, the Nahuatl's even better. But, just a beautiful passage to evoke all the different steps and the tools and the processing and the careful selection that goes in to preparing these beverages. Another preparation that shows up in the treatise of Dr. Francisco Hernandez, which I looked at here at the JCB, describes a teshli. And that's described as a paste with a little corn, and it's known for being an aphrodisiac. So, different preparations, different effects, and regionally very specific. And so what it really shows is that there's this long history of people taking cacao and making it local by crafting flavors and textures and creating this kind of cacao identity. And so there's this idea really of terroir, this unique flavors and quality associated just with the way the cacao itself is produced and then the way it's processed and presented. So it's really a gathering. I like to think of it as a gathering of places as tastes. Now, what's the word I have not really said so far? Chocolate. Chocolate. But it's there. It's clear that chocolate's just one of many, many, many different cacao preparations. And chocolate, I'm convinced, is a Nahuatl word. So it's from the same language family as the Aztecs. This is the thing that the JCB work really opened my eyes to, is that it's cited over and over and over again as a Guatemalan recipe that's associated with that. So what's the one of the earliest occurrences of the word chocolate anywhere? It's in colonial Guatemala. It's in a letter of a Jesuit priest who's writing in the 1570s describing this allegorical arch that they erect to celebrate the arrival of relics that the Pope sent. And they personify Guatemala as a woman holding a branch of a cacao tree with the ripe fruit. And then this is the poem on the allegorical arch. And English translates into, "From my very dowry, I bring you in a gourd vessel, en un tecomate, that is cacao and achiote to make chocolate." So, if you think back to my earlier examples, here's our aide-memoire. What is chocolate? Well, chocolate's a combination of cacao and achiote. And there are other Guatemalan examples that are, predate anything that occurs in central Mexico or other regions. And there are wonderful descriptions that state things like, although it is and this is quote, "Although it is true that every lady boasts of making her new invention a way of chocolate, with all this, generally the most common in all of the Indies is the one," oops, I lost the other half of my quote, "that is formed in tablets, which took its origin with the Guatemalan ladies, and this same one is the one that is dissolved with hot water and a touch of sweet, which gives it great charm, end quote. And so the tablets, again, the Tasse chocolate has these examples of these discs. That's the sort of thing that they're referring to. And then over and over again, as I started to look at this connection of names, recipes, and places, and so forth, you have even the British royal physician saying in the 1600s that chocolate is eternally drunk in Guatemala as ale is to England. So I don't think at least a British person could make a stronger statement. So what is achiote? Achiote, you might know it as annatto, but again, it's the seed of a plant, very bright, intense reddish color, and you can take the seed and grind it into a paste, and that's and you find it as a powder today. So if chocolate was always associated with Guatemala, how did that regionally specific, distinct recipe then become the name that we use to describe almost anything that has cacao, even things that don't have very much cacao in them? So I think that to really understand this, you have to step back and see what was happening with cacao and chocolate just before the Spanish arrived, because I think the use of cacao changes in a very particular way. And the evidence from the area where I did my archaeological research is a good illustration, probably the best illustration. And I worked in an area way down here in what's today Western El Salvador. All of this region, including part of Chiapas in Mexico, was considered colonial Guatemala. This, just for reference, is the limits of the Aztec Empire at the time the Spanish arrived. And the people who lived in this area of Western El Salvador called themselves Pipil. They spoke a language related to, it was a Nahuatl language related to Aztec, and they had very clear cultural connections to the rest of the Nahuatl world. In my archaeological work, it's a very clearly defined polity with these buffer zones on either edge, and a very dense settlement that is also sort of typically Nahuatl in that it's very dispersed settlement all over, not a lot of big cities and big nucleated settlements. So in general, it kind of would fit in quite well if you put the same sites and people in central Mexico. It's clear that they were worshiping the same deities, had some of the same sorts of political organization. This is an example of a polychrome pot from the region, and this particular design element is what would be called Eshuahuacatl, a blood letter, and you see this very rarely and very specifically, only in a few central Mexican documents, and it refers to a political title, and it's one of the 4 advisors to the Aztec king. And so here you see that same design element, the Eshuahuacatl. And other sorts of writing and evidence show that they had very much a very similar sort of political organization as other Nahuas at the time, and definitely very similar aesthetics. Like all of this, and this is all ceramics from my study region, and these are Chicocoliuqui. I mean, these are named iconographic elements done in a style of this red on buff pottery that's very typical for Nahuas at that time. And the other thing that we know that's going on at this point in time, the last couple hundred years before the Spanish arrived, from about AD 1300 to 1500 more or less, is that it's a time of a great deal of social and political instability across Mesoamerica. And you especially see this very interesting sort of Nahuatization of people adopting these aesthetics, political titles, even lineage names that are Nahua in their origin. And you know, Mayans have talked a fair bit about how the political instability was occurring, but the reason for it is a little bit less clear. And what helped me connect the dots about all of this was reading at the JCB Peter Martyr's De Orbe Novo. This is one of the first accounts of the Americas, or the first, and I wanted to see how he goes into great detail describing the people and the plants and animals and so forth, and so I was very interested in what he had to say. And when he starts talking about cacao, he starts talking about money. And he goes into actually a fairly long discussion about how cacao, the people of this new world were using cacao as money, that it was a more moral form of money than silver and gold, which is wrenched from the earth. This cacao grew on trees, and it wouldn't contribute to avarice the way that silver and gold did. And so previous work, it would sort of mention, oh yeah, cacao was used as money. But I began wondering if maybe this cacao emphasis as money was actually crucial in a change that happened in the economy not long before the Spanish arrived. And when you think about it, what happens when you have a money economy? Well, certain kinds of exchanges are much easier, but if you have a circulation of money, there's also this potential for people to accumulate money who maybe shouldn't socially for other reasons. You can have a nouveau riche. So it's binding people together. It also can level out some social distinction. So there often is sort of this jockeying to maintain privilege and status. So it can contribute to instability. Now, and then I found this is what my project was about at the JCB, was looking at evidence for pre-Columbian writing in this region where I worked. And so there are bits and pieces about descriptions of documents and redrawings by a 17th century chronicler, Pedro Antonio Fuentes y Guzman. And he describes these different documents. And as I was reconstructing what those documents were, I increasingly realized that they keep referring to money. And he describes them as referring to money, and he talks about, again, it sounds very much like what Peter Martyr was saying, that cacao was used to make payments, it was used to pay taxes, it was a medium of exchange, and then as I looked at more JCB sources, there's also this other hallmark of money, particularly, is that it has its own counting system. And we see this particular counting system especially associated with counts of cacao and counts of cacao as money. And then a real clincher is this rare imprint at the JCB that is a currency conversion chart of cacao and silver and gold. So, thank you, JCB. and as I've talked about this with other scholars, it sort of clicks. I've heard that all of the mine workers in Taxco, Mexico, this is northwest Mexico, late 16th, early 17th century, so 1580, 1615, paid in cacao. And most recently, I've heard of in Martinique of slaves and other people being paid in cacao in the Caribbean too. So it would make sense if you have a monetizing economy that that there would be instability. Why worry about the Nahuas in particular? Well, another element is that cacao, though it grows in many regions of the tropics fairly well, it takes just the right combination of fertile soil, the right amount of shade, not too much, not too little, the right amount of moisture, so irrigation sometimes. It takes a lot of skills and knowledge to make it produce really, really well. So super production is documented just for a few areas early on when the Spanish arrived. And where are those regions? One of them is this region on the Gulf Coast, the Acalan area. Then there's Soconusco that's on the border of Guatemala and Mexico. In this area, just a couple decades before the Spanish arrived, they conquered this region just to have direct access to cacao. Another region, Suchitepeque in Guatemala, was also very well known for producing lots of cacao. And then the fourth region, the Isalcos in western El Salvador. And compared to these other three regions, this region of the Isalcos was really quite small, like geographically small. The other places much larger in area extent and areas under cultivation. So even though, but the Isalcos ranks as far as in quantity, certainly above or at the same level or above. Oh yeah, and then the other thing too is that cacao is very much a calculated decision. So it's not the sort of thing you plant the seed, the next year you've got tons of pods on the tree. It takes 7, 8 years longer for some trees to really start producing. So it's an investment. It's a long-term investment, and it's investment of skills and knowledge and dedication. So these places had a certain amount of infrastructure going on when the Spanish arrived. And the other thing is that these regions are largely controlled by Nahuas. So for me, it makes sense that late post-classic shift of a monetizing economy, if it's controlled by Nahuas, then that is going to be a reference point for a lot of different groups. They're going to be very interested, and emulation makes sense in that context. Now, if we look at the Isalcos region in particular, the numbers are astounding by the time the Spanish really start to pay attention. And and again, this is from the JCB work, that the first way that cacao is defined or discussed is as money over and over again. So how much were the Isalcos producing? By the mid-16th century, out of one port, legally reported 1.2 billion cacao beans per year. This is from this little area. On top of that, and here's where the story gets really, really grim. And it gets grim, I think, because of this money connection. On top of that, you have tribute requirements. So the Spanish colonizers who came to the Americas often got these rewards of encomiendas. So it's labor and goods from a region that they paid, that those native peoples paid. in this region, the typical tribute requirements, the slackers, the ones that colonial officials were complaining about, supplied 20,000 cacao beans per person. The high-end, 118,000, 150,000 per person. This is on top. So the tribute requirement is on top of what's being exported. And then a policy in this area came to be for the encomenderos to maintain, complete control over the movements of the people who are producing cacao. And there are many, many complaints that these people who are by the people producing cacao, the PPO, saying, well, we only grow cacao. We don't make our clothes, we don't grow corn, we don't grow beans, so they have to pay for all of those other daily subsistence needs. Where do you think they were very strongly encouraged to buy those things? From the market that was controlled by the encomendero. And so there are all these documents that have complaints about to buy a pound of meat costs at least 10 times it, as other areas. Corn, all of these sorts of things. So it was kind of a company store that they had to buy from. And then on top of that, as if that's not enough, there are many, many reports of encomenderos sending their slaves out or other people to torture, put in jail, coerce in whatever possible way any other cacao that might be stored somewhere. All of this tremendous production, yes, that's part of the story too. Well, I'll give you the archaeological context, like the daily lives. We know that there's this tremendous amount coming out, but still, this is this sort of indicates a very consistent sort of production level for quite a long time. And it was really throughout. There are many, many accounts that say, if you want to make your money, you want to get rich quick, go down to this place, make your fortune. You can achieve your dreams. This is the place where money grows on trees, the Isalcos. But that doesn't explain why. So it's particularly important for that point. But when you see the word chocolate appear, the drink from this place appear in other sorts of texts and other kinds of contexts, and even in central Mexico, finally, it's around 1580. And looking at the timing for that, it's when the price spikes to an astronomical level for cacao in the colonial market. And who's the super producer of cacao at that point in time? It's the Isalcos. So why we use the word chocolate makes sense in this bigger context, because the name sticks. It's synonymous with wealth. It is money. It is, and that's the distinctive drink, the distinctive preparation from that one region. And it's sort of like you think of Q-tips or Kleenex or those sorts of brand names that are so popular today, and they stick, and we say them even though we're not buying that brand. That's where chocolate comes from. And so, again, this is an item in the JCB collection. This is the oldest use of the word chocolate held by any institution in the United States, is this manuscript that's here. And there it is, right in the middle of the page. And this is when you start to see chocolate, again, this sort of 1570s, 1580s-ish, throughout the Americas and then across the Atlantic into Europe. And it's also a time, the other thing that's going on that kind of helps spread the word and spread the use of it is that you have much more intense trade happening because of the regular establishment of the Manila galleon trade. So silver is going from Peru, and it's buying Asian spices and silks and so forth, and porcelains, bringing them back. It's supposed to go to Acapulco and back across to Spain eventually. But what I've found is that cacao is part of this circuit, and it's part of a totally illegal version of the circuit, because this is the proper one where the ships are going up this way, and there's not really any stopping off in Central America. They're supposed to be getting their things from Acapulco and other official ports. But what I find archaeologically is resettlement. Doesn't matter if it's a little shack way out in the middle of nowhere to different parts of cities, Ming Dynasty porcelain. And so this is something that's archaeologically very visible, and it's very common throughout the region. And these people have it in spades. And part of the reason for that is this cacao trade. And so with the archaeological evidence in mind, these complaints of, well, we have this ship and we're leaving Peru, but we really had to stop at this port of Acajutla and Isalcos because there was a storm. And then we just had to offload some things, and then we happened to get some cacao, but that's all, it was just an accident. It won't happen again. And then there's lots of accounts of that sort of way of really getting connected, cacao being connected into this circuit of silver and Asian products and cacao. You see it archaeologically. So it's this time of incredible production, incredible demands on the native peoples. It's all relying on native people's skills and knowledge. And archaeologically does it look like? What are the settlements like? There are hardly any people. The other thing, the other brutality of what's going on is that you have an average of about 40% drop off in population levels. And you see it archaeologically, there just aren't as many sites. I mean, there's not as many settlements. There are fewer settlements, nucleated settlements, but the density of settlements is just nothing like it was in the late pre-Columbian period. So fewer places, and at the same time, they're producing billions and billions and billions of cacao beans. So it tells you why chroniclers like Las Casas raise it up as an example of some of the worst abuse in the Americas. And people held hostage, people tortured, and all of it because they were chocoholics. To some degree, yeah, but it's really this money. The money drives them nuts. The money makes them especially intense. The pressures, really incredible. And then that idea of associating chocolate with wealth continues. And you have Spanish policies like cities established that are to provide a moral order. And in the case of this region, it's talked about not as moral order just for the indigenous population, just for the natives to Christianize them, but a moral order for those Spaniards who are just the colonizers who are way out of control. They established Spanish cities trying to get Spaniards to move into those cities and out of Indian pueblos. And that period of where the Manila galleon trade really gets going, and it's all illegal, is also archaeologically the maximum extent of these settlements. And then after after that as cacao shifts to other regions of the world for production. These settlements become less. So you have chocolate propagate to all these regions. It's becomes a term of reference to describe all sorts of things, and much more common in parlance. It becomes also this moral question. It's a worth committing murder for. It causes a rift between Dominicans and other Catholic orders in debating about whether chocolate was a drink or a food, whether it was substantial or not. And if it was a food, you were not supposed to eat it before breaking the ecclesiastical. You don't break your ecclesiastical fast except with communion. Well, people, especially in Guatemala, are talked about as taking cups of chocolate during Mass to kind of pass the time until it was over. So it was pleasurable and enjoyable, and you wanted your cup of chocolate. And the bishop found out about this, and he was Dominican, and he issued an edict that any parishioners would be excommunicated if they were caught drinking chocolate during Mass. Well, those parishioners decided, well, we'll go to rural churches, and maybe they won't be paying so much attention there. So that goes along for a while, and then the bishop finds out about it, and he issues an edict that any priest administering Mass to parishioners who are drinking chocolate will be excommunicated. Shortly thereafter, the bishop dies after drinking a cup of chocolate. The word was that those parishioners, it was worth killing for. And the following bishop didn't have the same policies about chocolate. So there's this really exuberant consumption that starts to happen of chocolate in all sorts of ways. But then it presents a dilemma, because if you're starting to call all these things chocolate, what is chocolate exactly? What do you mean? Or, what are these people referring to? And so I started this, sort of applied an archaeological mind to historical information, and started thinking about recipes and comparing recipes and seeing what sort of information we could get from that. Now, the sources that I use, it's not a traditional sort of recipe. This is a very typical sort of example, that they're medical treatises that describe these different preparations and the ingredients that went in them and their effects. But I compiled them, and first of all, we can get a sense of the ingredients of Mesoamerican, of American recipes, and the kind of flavor profile, the sorts of things that were added to them during the colonial period. And you see a sort of several flavor notes that are especially emphasized. One of them is spice, so you have different chiles and other sort of spicy and kind of almost smoky tasting things. Sweet, and very early on, sugar becomes used as a sweetener, replacing honey in a lot of recipes. And then the addition of corn, which we know from pre-Columbian examples. And then also these different sorts of floury additions. So these are some other, some examples of so it's this sort of floral, umami, sweet, spicy mix. And then what about European recipes? Did they adopt it just wholesale? Well, not exactly. And this is just a summary of the different sorts of ingredients. And you see, actually, you might think that the European examples would be blander, but they're not. They're very pungent, and with sort of that earthiness with musk added in, or ambergris, and lots of different kinds of spice. And then especially a kind of a sweet floral with orange blossom and ginger and things like that. And then a lot of the American sorts of flowery flavorings show up. So you get a sense that there's a difference between the European recipes and the American ones, but I wanted a little more systematic and consistent sort of comparison. And for archaeologists, we often compare things that are described, like brown pottery, burnished, that sort of thing. It's not necessarily something that you can count or measure. And so the geographer at Illinois State University and I applied a Jacquard similarity coefficient. It just takes lists of traits and compares how different or similar they are. And you end up with something like this for all those recipes, a kind of family tree of chocolate and cacao preparations. And what you see is that they're very regionally distinct. They form these groups. And so here in a family tree, you know, the branches are the same height and there's equal relation. Here, the differences in height mean something. So if there's very little height, it means they're pretty much the same thing, and a big height means they're quite different. So for all of these recipes, what is this branch? The Guatemalan recipes, chocolate. And so I think of this as almost like a biological speciation event, where you have the origin, the founding, and then speciation as it moves into these other regions and other contexts. And then if you'll notice, blue's what? Blue's Europe. So Italy, Spain, France. And so you have a very distinctive branch that's French and English and Italian recipes. And then another branch that's largely Spanish and Mexican recipes. So it forms its own branch. But even within this largely Mexican group, the European examples are off on their own. So they're still forming, you know, they're still standing apart. The other kind of odd isolate is Peru. You know, very, very similar recipes, quite different from the others, but generally related to these kind of Mexican-like recipes. So what does all this say? Regionally distinct, very specific tastes, very different profiles. You move from one place to the next. It's really a political geography of taste that happens with chocolate. Another way of representing it, I didn't do those, this is a GIS map, GIS-based map of that same data. And the arrows, the thickness of the arrows shows the degree of relationship. And what this really emphasizes is these colonies have very strong relationships back into Europe, and the connections are less within the Americas as far as the degree of similarities of taste. So very, very different and distinct, and all feeding into Europe. And then within Europe, England, you'd think it'd be Spain would be the one who's kind of disseminating these recipes, and that's sort of because they're the main colonizing power for a lot of this area and for this time period. And no, it's England. Like those English, so the English are the tastemakers. And other people are imitating that, you know, in many ways. So each region had its own pattern, its own specialty. That they called chocolate, but it wasn't exactly, what pre-Columbian chocolate was. And the other point that I'd really like to emphasize is that chocolate's one of those few American words that was never translated. Unlike maize, which can be referred to as corn, or kilchochit. You all know what that is, right? Vanilla. So a lot of these names, these native names, get translated into something else for common parlance. But people every day and across the world speak a little Nahuatl when they ask for chocolate. And the word chocolate comes to refer to a broad class of states and flavors and colors by this one untranslated term. So the works really convinced me that the way we experience chocolate today has stronger pre-Columbian roots than is often recognized, and that changes in taste in chocolate navigated difficult social, political, and economic dilemmas. The cultural history of taste, here taken in the broadest sense, is a journey into how we think of ourselves, how we savor life. Indeed, this has been the case for centuries. The foundations for these transcendent yet contradictory relationships of chocolate lie in the pre-Columbian uses and meanings of cacao, which European colonists then took up in new ways. And so facets that seem like colonial inventions were really just appropriation. Europeans took up this siren called chocolate in ways that amplified what Mesoamericans had already been doing. So from a broad array of flavors, colors, and forms, colonial people chose particular qualities of chocolate for specific reasons that related to societal ideas of order, purity, and power. And that the everyday realities of colonial life, work, and commerce really shaped those choices. So this colonial dilemma was how to incorporate new wealth in people, yet maintain social and political and economic hierarchy. So taste and empire are really inextricably tied together. Fantastic wealth was built upon extraction and coerced labor to supply an expanding citizenry and consumption. And both of those fueled cravings for social distinctions. So the temptation to assume continuities in what chocolate tastes, smells, sounds, feels like robs chocolate of its flavor by letting present experiences overdetermine how we understand it in the past. So we like to say we are what we eat, but I think we eat what we are. Thank you.